The Rigby estate had stood, imposing yet serene, amidst the rolling hills of the English countryside for over 2 centuries. Its stone walls, cloaked in ivy, held the chill of the early spring air, while inside, the warmth of numerous fireplaces fought back the morning mist that clung to the vast gardens. On this particularly somber morning, the ancient oaks stood as silent witnesses to the arrival of the Rigby family, convened not for the customary summer gala, but for a gathering marked by the shadow of loss. Eleanor Rigby, the second eldest of the 4 siblings, drove through the wrought iron gates, her eyes briefly catching the reflection of the grand manor in the rearview mirror. It was a sight both familiar and daunting, evoking memories of laughter-filled evenings and whispered secrets in dimly lit corners. Today, however, the estate seemed to echo with a different tone, one of whispered grievances and unsettled scores. As she parked her car beside the fountain, whose cherubs had frolicked in its waters for generations, Eleanor's heart clenched. She hadn't been back since her father's funeral 2 months ago. Stepping out, Eleanor adjusted her coat against the brisk wind, her mind racing through the possible scenarios that might unfold today. Her brother Charles, ever the opportunist, had been unusually silent since their father's passing. That silence spoke volumes to Eleanor. It was the calm before a storm she knew she must weather. Charles, on the other hand, stood at the east wing's bay window, overlooking the driveway. His stance was rigid, the morning light casting shadows over his sharp, calculating features. At 39, he had taken the mantle of the eldest son to heart, often overshadowing his siblings in both business and personal matters. Today was no different. He watched as each member of the family arrived, his mind plotting, weighing his words and actions like a gambler with a royal flush. Inside the manor, the rest of the family trickled in. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and lavender polish, the grand hallway adorned with portraits of Rigby's past, their stern gazes surveying the new generation. The housekeeper, Mrs. Collins, a stout woman who had served the family for over 3 decades, greeted each member with a somber nod. Her eyes, however, lingered longer on Eleanor, a silent exchange of solidarity. The siblings gathered in the drawing room, a majestic space dominated by a large stone fireplace. Antique furniture lined the walls, each piece a testament to the family's enduring legacy and accumulated wealth. The atmosphere was tense, each person acutely aware of the gravity that the reading of the will would bring. Whispers filled the room, a low murmur punctuated by the occasional clink of china as tea was served. Eleanor took a seat by the window, her gaze lost in the sprawling lawns where she and her siblings had played as children. The weight of her father's legacy was a heavy cloak around her shoulders, but she was determined to bear it with dignity. She knew the importance of today. It was not just about dividing wealth, but preserving what generations had built. As the clock chimed 10, the family lawyer, Mr. Gregory, entered the room. His presence signaled that the moment had arrived. Papers rustled as he prepared to read the will, the legal document that held the future of the Rigby family. Eleanor straightened, her eyes meeting Charles's for a brief, electric moment. The battle lines were drawn, and as the first words of the will echoed through the room, the storm began to break. The grand drawing room of the Rigby estate was steeped in the quiet tension of anticipation as Mr. Gregory, the family solicitor, cleared his throat. The heavy curtains were drawn, casting the room into a respectful gloom, befitting the solemnity of the occasion. Each member of the Rigby family sat rigidly, their expressions a mask of stoic calm or thinly veiled anxiety. "Thank you all for gathering here today," Mr. Gregory began, his voice resonant against the high ceilings adorned with intricate plasterwork. "As you are aware, we are here to read the last will and testament of Mr. Alastair Rigby, deceased these past 2 months. He adjusted his glasses, the legal documents in his hands a tangible echo of finality. Charles sat forward, his eyes sharp and calculating. Eleanor, maintaining a composed exterior, felt her heart beat with a mix of dread and resolve. The younger siblings, Margaret and James, looked on, visibly nervous about the implications of the will on their futures. Mr. Gregory unfolded the will, the paper rustling softly in the quiet room. "I, Alastair Rigby, being of sound mind and body, hereby declare this to be my last will and testament," he read. The formal words seemed to hang in the air, each one laden with the weight of finality. As to my physical and liquid assets, Mr. Gregory continued, I have made the following provisions. He paused, looking over the rim of his glasses at the family assembled before him. To my son, Charles, I bequeath the sum of £200,000, along with the Rigby flat in London. A gasp went through the room, subtle but audible. Charles's face hardened, his hands tightening into fists on his lap. It was a significant amount, yet far less than what he had expected as the eldest and once favored son. To my daughter Eleanor, Mr. Gregory read on, I bequeath the sum of £300,000 and the management of the Rigby Charitable Foundation. Eleanor's brow furrowed slightly, surprised by the responsibility and trust her father had placed in her, more so than the sum of money. And to my other children, Margaret and James, the solicitor's voice filled the room, I bequeath the remainder of my estate equally, including the shares in Rigby Enterprises and the country estate where we are currently gathered. Silence enveloped the room as the full impact of the will's contents settled over the family. Margaret and James, who had braced themselves for minimal inheritance, exchanged glances, a mix of relief and disbelief on their young faces. Charles was the first to break the silence. There must be some mistake, he said sharply, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. This cannot be my father's final wish. Mr. Gregory looked at Charles with a calm, unyielding gaze. The will was drafted according to your father's explicit instructions, he stated, his tone brooking no argument. It was witnessed by myself and my associate, and it fulfills all legal requirements. Eleanor watched her brother, understanding the storm of emotions raging through him, anger, disbelief, perhaps even a sense of betrayal. She felt a twinge of sympathy but remained silent, her own mind racing through the possibilities of what had led her father to make such a decision. As the family absorbed the shock, the room felt suddenly too small, the air too thick. Charles stood abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the ornate wooden floor. I will contest this, he declared, his voice resolute, eyes blazing. I will not accept it. The statement hung in the air, a challenge thrown down amidst the shadows of the drawing room. The stage was set, the players aligned, and as Mr. Gregory quietly folded the will, the battle lines were drawn not just for the inheritance, but for the soul of the Rigby family itself. In the days following the will reading, the Rigby estate transformed into a silent battlefield. Charles, seething with a blend of indignation and betrayal, retreated into the dark, oak-paneled study that had once been his father's sanctuary. The room was suffused with the scent of leather and old books, a testament to generations of Rigby men who had brooded over family legacies. Charles, however, was not lost in contemplation, but in calculation. His eyes, usually so commanding and sure, now flickered with the flame of desperation as he plotted his next moves. Eleanor, meanwhile, assumed the role of the calm after the storm. She moved through the halls of the estate with a serene grace, her mind as active as Charles's, but focused on preservation rather than conquest. Her conversations with the younger siblings, Margaret and James, were filled with reassurances and strategic advice. She knew her strength lay not just in the legal knowledge she wielded as a sword, but also in the unity of those who stood by her. As the sun dipped below the horizon one chilly evening, Charles summoned his allies to the study. Among them were his closest confidants from within the family business, men and women who had much to gain from his continued ascendancy. The golden glow of the desk lamp cast long shadows as Charles laid out his strategy. This will is not just unfair, it's irrational, Charles asserted, his voice a low growl. Our father was not in his right mind. We all know how manipulative Eleanor can be. Perhaps she influenced him more than we ever realized. His audience nodded, murmurs of agreement filling the room. They were all too aware of the stakes. Their own fortunes were indirectly tied to Charles's success. Plans were made, legal arguments drafted, and financial records subpoenaed. The night grew deep as conspiracies were woven like the tapestries that adorned the walls. Across the estate, in the conservatory where moonlight filtered through the glass roof and danced upon the orchids, Eleanor held a quieter meeting. Margaret and James sat with her, their faces illuminated by the soft light of a single lantern. They listened intently as Eleanor explained the legal implications of their father's will and the likely challenges ahead. "We must stand together," Eleanor urged, her voice both gentle and firm. "Charles will fight dirty, but we have the law and Dad's wishes on our side. Remember, he made these decisions for a reason." Margaret, usually so reticent, spoke up, her voice shaky but determined. "I can't believe Charles would go this far. It's like he's a different person." Eleanor reached across the small table, taking her sister's hands in hers. "Grief and greed can change a person. We need to be prepared for everything." As the meeting disbanded, the siblings felt a renewed sense of purpose, fortified by Eleanor's resolve and clarity. They understood that the coming days would test their bonds as a family. The estate, usually so staid, now thrummed with the undercurrents of impending conflict. Servants whispered in hallways, catching snippets of conversations, their loyalties as divided as the family they served. The atmosphere was charged, every glance and gesture laden with meaning. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the dew-soaked lawns, Eleanor stood by her bedroom window, looking out over the estate. Her home, now an arena, required her to be both general and diplomat. She was ready to defend her father's last wishes, to fight for what she believed was right. But deep in her heart, a pang of sorrow lingered for the family unity that was perhaps the greatest casualty of all. Eleanor's journey through the labyrinthine hallways of the Rigby estate felt like a passage through time. Her footsteps echoed softly on the ancient wood floors, leading her to the seldom-used attic that housed the family archives. Here, amidst the musty scent of old paper and fading leather, lay the documented history of the Rigby lineage. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that pierced the small attic windows, each speck a silent testament to the years gone by. As she rummaged through the piles of old legal documents, letters, and diaries, Eleanor sought to understand her father's mind in the days before his death. A particular leather-bound journal, embossed with her father's initials, caught her eye. Its pages, yellowed with age, contained the private thoughts of Alistair Rigby, penned in his meticulous hand. Here, amidst reflections and day-to-day musings, Eleanor hoped to find clues to the decision that had so fractured her family. Flipping through the pages, Eleanor paused as a particular entry from several months before her father's passing caught her attention. It read, "Charles's latest venture worries me deeply. The risks he takes could endanger not just his own future, but that of the entire estate. I have spoken to him, pleaded with him, but my words fall on deaf ears. He is blinded by ambition, a trait I once admired but now fear." This insight into her father's concerns was a revelation. It painted a picture of a man torn between paternal affection and the stewardship of his ancestors' legacy. Eleanor felt a pang of empathy for her father, understanding now the burden of his decisions. Further into the journal, another entry detailed a quiet afternoon her father had spent with Margaret and James, observing their simplicity and genuine love for the land and its heritage. Margaret and James see this estate not as a means to an end, but as a part of their soul. Perhaps in them, the true spirit of the Rigbys will endure. They do not seek to expand, only to preserve. These words solidified Eleanor's resolve. Her father's intentions were clear. He had sought to protect the estate from the reckless ambitions of Charles by entrusting it to those who valued it most. Armed with this newfound understanding, Eleanor knew what she must do next. She gathered the journal and several other pertinent documents and prepared to confront Charles. But first, she needed to share these revelations with Margaret and James. Later that day, in the quiet of the estate's old library, Eleanor met with her younger siblings. The room was a sanctuary of knowledge, its walls lined with books that had witnessed centuries of Rigby deliberations and decisions. As she relayed her father's fears and hopes, the gravity of their task became even more apparent to Margaret and James. Margaret, typically the more emotional of the siblings, was moved to tears. "He really was looking out for us, wasn't he?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. James, ever the pragmatist, nodded, his face set in a determined frown. "We can't let Dad down. Charles needs to see reason, not just for our sake, but for the future of this estate." Eleanor closed the meeting with a call to unity. "Tomorrow, I confront Charles. I'll show him Dad's words. Maybe, just maybe, he'll understand. That night, Eleanor lay awake, the journal by her bedside. The weight of her family's legacy pressed upon her, but so too did a sense of purpose. She was not just fighting for land or money, she was fighting to honor her father's last wish, to preserve the heart of the Rigby family for generations yet to come. The echoes of the past, captured in her father's handwriting, had given her a path forward, and she was ready to follow it, wherever it might lead. The morning sun cast a golden light across the Rigby estate, its rays cutting through the fog of tension that had settled over the manor. Today, Eleanor would confront Charles, armed not just with legal documents, but with the moral weight of their father's private thoughts. The library, with its towering bookcases and the scent of aged paper, would serve as the backdrop for this pivotal family meeting. Charles stood at the great window overlooking the south lawns, his posture rigid, every line of his body broadcasting defiance. The rest of the siblings had already gathered, forming a semicircle around the grand oak table that dominated the room. Margaret's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, betraying her anxiety, while James's expression was one of grim determination. As Eleanor entered, the room fell into a weighted silence. She carried herself with an air of quiet authority, her father's journal tucked under her arm like a shield. She took her place opposite Charles, laying the journal and other documents before her on the table. "Charles," she began, her voice clear and steady, "I understand your frustrations and your ambitions. But we need to consider the future of this estate and the family above all." Charles scoffed, his gaze cold. "And you think undermining my rightful inheritance protects our family?" Eleanor paused, allowing the tension to swell before she responded. "I think our father saw a potential threat to the estate's longevity and acted accordingly. He wrote extensively about his concerns." With a measured movement, Eleanor opened the journal to a marked page, sliding it across the table towards Charles. "Read this. It's in his own words." Charles hesitated, his expression faltering as he glanced down at the open journal. The room held its breath as he read, his eyes flicking rapidly across the page. "This changes nothing," he said finally, his voice a mix of anger and something that sounded suspiciously like despair. "He was wrong." Eleanor sighed softly. "He was worried, Charles. He feared your ventures might risk more than just your own future, but that of the entire estate. This was his way of protecting it, through Margaret and James." Margaret finally spoke up, her voice small but firm. "We don't want to fight, Charles. We just want to honor Dad's wishes. Can't you see that?" Charles looked between his siblings, the hardness in his eyes battling with a dawning realization of his isolation. Eleanor watched him closely, her heart aching with a mix of sympathy and resolve. This was her brother, whom she had once admired and loved without reservation. But now, they stood on opposite sides of a chasm that seemed too wide to bridge. "It's not just about the money or the estate," James added, his tone conciliatory. "It's about us as a family. What are we, if not for each other?" Charles remained silent, his fingers drumming a soft, erratic beat on the oak table. The minutes stretched on, each one heavy with the weight of unspoken words and unresolved grievances. Finally, he stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I need to think about this," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else, and left the room with a palpable sense of defeat. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The confrontation had not yielded a clear victory, but perhaps it had ignited a spark of reflection in Charles. As she gathered the papers, her eyes lingered on the doorway through which her brother had disappeared. This family, like the estate, was weathered and worn, marked by time and trials. But it was not yet broken. As long as there was still a chance to mend the fractures, Eleanor would fight, not just for the estate, but for the heart of the Rigby family itself. The days following the confrontation were thick with a suspenseful calm that enveloped the Rigby estate like the heavy, oppressive air before a storm. Eleanor could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing upon the household, each member lost in their own thoughts and fears about the future. Charles had secluded himself in the western wing of the manor, a part of the estate he had always claimed as his personal sanctuary. Here, Amid the dark wood paneling and heavy drapes that shut out the soft light of early spring, he brooded over his dwindling options. The words of his father, relayed through Eleanor and the pages of his journal, haunted him. They echoed in the dim corridors of his mind, a relentless reminder of what he stood to lose. In contrast, the rest of the family found a fragile sense of unity in their shared purpose. Margaret and James, usually so reticent in matters of conflict, had taken to joining Eleanor in the library each morning to discuss strategies and scenarios, determined to uphold their father's wishes. Their meetings were marked by quiet intensity, each aware of the stakes at play. As Eleanor prepared for yet another day of uncertainty, she received an unexpected message from Charles requesting her presence in the garden pavilion, a neutral place, away from the oppressive atmosphere of the manor. Curious and cautiously hopeful, Eleanor agreed. The garden pavilion overlooked the east lawns, where the early blooms of daffodils and tulips were beginning to push through the cold earth. The beauty of the scene stood in stark contrast to the tension that awaited her. Charles was already there when she arrived, standing by the open windows, his figure silhouetted against the light. He turned as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Eleanor," he began, his voice more subdued than she had heard in days, "I've been doing a lot of thinking." Eleanor remained silent, giving him space to continue. "I've been stubborn," he admitted, his gaze drifting to the gardens outside. "And maybe I didn't want to see the truth of Father's concerns. But I've looked over everything again, the accounts, the plans, his journal. I can't fight this, not without tearing apart what little is left of our family." Eleanor listened, a mixture of relief and wariness tempering her response. "So, what are you saying, Charles?" He sighed, a sound of defeat mixed with resignation. "I'm saying I won't contest the will. I'll accept Father's decision. But I want something in return." "And what's that?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite the quickening of her heart. "Assurance," Charles replied, turning to face her fully now. "Assurance that the estate and the business will not just be about preservation, but about progress too. I want to be involved, Eleanor, not as the head, but as a part of it. I need to know that I have a place here." Eleanor considered his words, weighing them against the myriad outcomes she had envisioned. "If you're willing to work with us, truly work with us, then yes, you have a place here. But it has to be about more than just profit, Charles. It has to be about this family's legacy." Charles nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "I understand. And I'll try. That's all I can promise right now." It was not a perfect resolution, but it was a start, a turning point from which they could begin to rebuild. As they left the pavilion together, walking back towards the manor, the spring air felt a little lighter, a little warmer. The path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but for the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt that perhaps, just perhaps, they could face them as a family. The Rigby estate, once shrouded in the somber tones of discord, slowly began to breathe a lighter air as spring unfurled its hopeful hues across the landscape. The resolution reached between Eleanor and Charles had not immediately dispelled all the shadows, but it had opened a window, allowing the first warm breezes of reconciliation to stir the long stagnant curtains of the manor. In the days that followed, the household witnessed a subtle transformation. Charles, having relinquished his challenge to the will, started to engage with the estate's affairs in a manner that was less commanding and more collaborative. His meetings with Eleanor and the others were no longer battlefields, but forums for genuine discussion about the future of the estate. Eleanor found herself cautiously optimistic. Watching Charles interact with Margaret and James, she felt a burgeoning hope that perhaps their family could mend the rifts that had so nearly torn them apart. Yet, she remained vigilant, aware that old habits and resentments could resurface if not carefully managed. Margaret and James, for their part, took their new responsibilities seriously. Margaret began to oversee the conservation efforts on the estate, a project that brought her immense satisfaction and allowed her to connect more deeply with the land she loved. James, interested in the business side, worked closely with Charles to learn the nuances of the family enterprises, bringing fresh ideas that were initially met with skepticism but gradually gained respect. The estate itself seemed to respond to this new era of stewardship. The gardens were lush and meticulously kept, the staff moved with a renewed sense of purpose, and even the ancient walls of the manor seemed to stand a bit prouder under the careful management of its heirs. As the season changed, the family decided to host a garden party, not just for themselves, but as a celebration for the entire staff and their families. It was a gesture of goodwill and gratitude, a symbol of the family's renewed commitment to each other and to those who helped maintain their legacy. The day of the party dawned clear and bright. The lawns were dotted with tables laden with food prepared by the kitchen staff, colorful bunting fluttered in the breeze, and laughter filled the air, a sound that had been all too rare in recent months. Eleanor watched as Charles helped set up chairs, joking with the groundskeepers, and she felt a warmth in her heart that had nothing to do with the sunshine. During the party, Eleanor took a moment to speak to the gathered guests, her family standing beside her. Today is not just a celebration of the start of summer, she announced, her voice carrying over the crowd. It's a celebration of all of us together. This estate, this family, depends on every single one of us working together, respecting each other, and moving forward together. The applause was heartfelt, and as it died down, Charles stepped forward. His glance at Eleanor was one of gratitude before he addressed the crowd. I've learned a lot recently about humility and about family, he admitted. I'm here to work with all of you, to learn from you, and to make sure that we all succeed. As the party continued into the evening, Eleanor found herself standing beside the old oak that overlooked the festivities. The tree's sturdy branches stretched wide, its leaves whispering in the gentle evening breeze. Like the tree, the Rigby family had deep roots and, she hoped, the resilience to withstand storms. The path ahead would undoubtedly hold challenges, but as Eleanor looked at her family, her home, and the people around them, she felt ready to meet whatever came their way. Together, they would write the next chapter of the Rigby legacy, one filled with cooperation, respect, and a newfound appreciation for each other. This, Eleanor realized, was not just a new dawn for the estate, but for each of them as part of this storied family.